I fell in love with a man I never met, a man who remembered my birthday, learned words in my own language just to surprise me, and promised to spend the rest of his life beside me. I believed him so completely that I gave him my retirement savings, my mother's jewelry, and land that had belonged to my husband's family for generations. I was 68 years old, and for the first time in 9 years of silence, I felt truly seen. What I did not know was that every photograph, every phone call, every declaration of love was built from something that never existed at all. By the time I understood the truth, I had lost almost everything I had spent a lifetime building. This is my story. There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a house after everyone you raised has left it. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of waiting, for a phone to ring, for a car to pull into the driveway, for someone to simply ask how your day was. I had lived inside that silence for almost 9 years before I made the mistake that cost me everything I had spent a lifetime building. I want to tell you what it felt like to be 70 years old and still capable of hope, because I think people assume that hope fades with age. It does not. If anything, it grows sharper, more desperate, more willing to believe in things that a younger, more guarded version of yourself would have questioned in an instant. That is what nobody warns you about growing old alone. Your heart does not get wiser. Sometimes it gets softer, and softness is exactly what predators are looking for. My name does not matter yet. What matters is the house I lived in, a house that used to be full of noise, school bags dropped by the door, the smell of coconut oil in my daughter's hair before she left for college, my son's laughter carrying through the courtyard on evenings when his father was still alive to laugh with him. That house, in a quiet town in the southern part of India, had become a museum of a life that no longer existed. My husband had passed away, and both of my children had built their futures thousands of miles away in America, chasing opportunities that our small town could never offer them. I was proud of them. I want to be clear about that from the very beginning. I never once resented their choice to leave. I encouraged it. I packed their suitcases myself. But pride does not fill an empty chair at the dinner table, and encouragement does not answer the phone when it rings at 2 a.m. because you cannot sleep and there is no one beside you to talk to. The calls from my children became shorter over the years, not because they loved me less, but because life had simply filled up their days. Jobs, mortgages, children of their own. I understood this intellectually. Emotionally, I understood nothing except the ache of a house that echoed every time I walked from one room to another. So when a friend request appeared on my phone from a man who said his name was Michael, I did not think of it as anything extraordinary. My grandchildren had convinced me to join social media so I could see photographs of their lives abroad, and over time I had become somewhat active there, commenting on old friends' posts, sharing recipes, feeling for the first time in years like I was part of something larger than my own 4 walls. His profile picture showed a man in his early 70s, silver-haired, standing in front of what looked like a beautiful lake somewhere in the American countryside. His profile said he was a retired engineer living in North Carolina. There were photographs of him hiking, of him with a golden retriever, of what appeared to be a modest but comfortable home. There were comments from people who appeared to be his friends, and even what looked like family members. Everything about it looked ordinary. Everything about it looked real. He wrote to me first, a simple message saying he had come across my profile through a mutual interest in gardening, since I had once posted photographs of the small vegetable patch behind my house. He said something about how peaceful it looked, how it reminded him of a simpler kind of life he wished he still had access to. I did not think much of it. I replied politely, the way I would to any stranger, and went about my day. But he wrote again the next day, and the day after that. Slowly, without my even noticing the shift, our conversations became a fixture of my mornings and evenings. He told me he had lost his wife to cancer several years earlier, and that the loneliness of the house they once shared had become unbearable. He said he admired Indian culture deeply, that he had always wanted to visit, that he found something beautiful in the idea of a life lived with more patience, more respect for elders, more warmth between families. He asked me questions no one had asked me in years. What did I dream about when I was young? What did I miss most about my husband? What made me laugh? I want you to understand something about loneliness, because I do not think people who have never experienced it in its purest form can truly grasp its power. Loneliness does not simply make you sad. It makes you vulnerable in a way that nothing else can. It rewires what you consider reasonable. A question that might have seemed intrusive from a stranger 2 years earlier now felt like tenderness. An intimacy that should have taken months to build felt instead like something I had simply been missing, finally arriving. Michael remembered small details I mentioned only once. He asked about my health with what seemed like genuine concern. When I described a recipe I had made for a local temple gathering, he researched it afterward and asked me, in his next message, whether I had used a particular spice that he had read was common in that dish. He even attempted, clumsily and endearingly, to learn a few words in my native language, Malayalam, just to surprise me. I remember laughing out loud, alone in my kitchen, at his attempts to pronounce something simple, and feeling, in that laughter, a lightness I had not felt in years. Within a few months, he began speaking about the future, not vaguely, not as some distant possibility, but with specific plans. He said he wanted to visit India, to meet me in person, to meet whatever family I was willing to introduce him to. He spoke about marriage, not as a proposal exactly, but as an inevitability we were both simply walking toward. He described in detail wanting to bring me to live with him in the United States, close enough perhaps that I could finally see my grandchildren more than once every few years. He sent me photographs of a spacious house with a wraparound porch, saying it was where we would live together. He sent a photograph of a car he claimed was his, a silver sedan parked in a driveway lined with autumn leaves. A few times we even had video calls, though they were always brief, always plagued by what he explained was a poor internet connection in his rural area, the picture freezing every few seconds. His voice cutting in and out just enough that I never quite got a clear, sustained look at his face in motion. I did not question this. Why would I? I had no reason yet to distrust a man who had shown me, in every other way, that he cared. For the better part of a year, this became my life, waking up to a message, falling asleep, composing my reply, telling my closest friend about this kind American engineer who had somehow found his way into my heart despite the distance. Despite the improbability of it all, she was happy for me. Everyone who knew was happy for me. I had gone from a woman defined by her grief to a woman who blushed reading messages on her phone, and there is no way to explain how intoxicating that transformation felt after 9 years of silence. I did not know then that everything I believed about Michael Carter was a carefully constructed illusion, built by someone who understood with terrifying precision exactly what a lonely woman in her late 60s needed to hear. I did not know that the photographs belonged to a stranger who had never sat by that lake, never owned that dog, never lived in that house. I did not know that somewhere a script was being followed, one that had likely been used on dozens of women before me, each of us believing we were uniquely, finally, loved. All I knew at that point in my story was that for the first time since my husband's death, I had something to look forward to every single day. And I would soon learn that the very thing making me feel alive again was the same thing that was about to take almost everything I had. The first time Michael mentioned money, it did not feel like a request. It felt like a confession, the kind a person makes to someone they trust completely, someone they believe will understand rather than judge. He told me that he had arranged to send me something special, a package containing gifts he had picked out himself, along with what he called important documents, papers he said were related to a small property he owned that he wanted to eventually transfer into both our names once we were married. It sounded thoughtful. It sounded like a man planning a future, not a man planning an exit strategy for my finances. A week later, he messaged me sounding distressed in a way I had not seen from him before. He said the package had been held at customs, that there was some issue with the paperwork, some fee that needed to be paid before it could be released to me. He seemed embarrassed even bringing it up. He said he hated the idea of asking me for anything, that it went against everything he believed about how a man should treat a woman he respected. But the amount was small, he said, and he promised he would pay me back the moment he arrived in India, which he insisted was only a matter of weeks away. I sent the money. It did not feel like a loss. It felt like helping someone I loved through an inconvenient bureaucratic tangle, The kind of small crisis that happens to everyone occasionally. I remember feeling almost proud that I could be the one to help him for once, after months of him making me feel cared for. But the customs fee was only the beginning. A few weeks later came a story about frozen accounts. Michael explained, in message after message full of what appeared to be genuine frustration, that a bank in his country had flagged his account due to a supposed international transfer he had attempted to make in preparation for his trip. He said the bank was demanding a verification fee before releasing his funds. He apologized profusely, said he felt ashamed to keep coming to me, said this was not the man he wanted to be in my eyes, and because I had already convinced myself that this was a temporary situation, a strange but explainable series of coincidences, I sent more money. Then came the taxes. Then came a legal fee tied to what he described as an inheritance dispute involving his late wife's estate, something he needed resolved before he could fully commit his finances to our future together. Every explanation was detailed. Every story came wrapped in guilt and gratitude, a combination that I now understand is one of the most effective tools a manipulator can use, because it makes the victim feel less like someone being exploited and more like someone generously saving the person they love. I want to be honest about something painful. At no point during these months did I feel like a fool. I felt like a woman in love, making sacrifices the way people in love have always made sacrifices for each other. I told myself stories to protect the fantasy. I told myself that Michael was simply unlucky. That bureaucracy in his country must be different from what I knew. That soon all of this would be behind us, and we would laugh about it together on the porch of that house he had shown me in photographs. My retirement savings were the first thing to go. Money I had set aside over 4 decades of teaching mathematics to secondary school students, money meant to support me quietly through my final years, disappeared in a series of transfers that felt, at the time, like small acts of devotion rather than what they truly were. When my savings ran low, Michael did not ask directly for more. Instead, he would simply describe the severity of his new problem and let silence do the asking. I would offer before he even had to request it, because by then I had convinced myself that his success was my success, that his relief was my relief. I liquidated investments I had made carefully over the years, modest accounts meant to grow slowly and support me in old age. I remember calling the bank to close one of these accounts and feeling a strange, hollow pride, telling the young man on the phone that I was doing this for someone I loved. I sold jewelry that had belonged to my mother, pieces I had always imagined passing on to my daughter one day. I told myself, as I handed them over to a jeweler in town, that jewelry was just metal and stone, that love was worth more than sentimental objects, that Michael and I would build new memories, new heirlooms, together. And when even that was not enough, I did something I never imagined myself capable of. I took a loan against a small piece of family land, property that had belonged to my husband's family for generations. Land I had always considered sacred in some quiet, unspoken way. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself that within weeks, Michael would arrive, the debts would be settled, and everything I had given would be returned tenfold in the form of a life shared with someone who finally, truly saw me. Throughout all of this, my friends began to grow quiet whenever I brought him up. I noticed the hesitation in their voices, the careful way they changed the subject or asked gentle, probing questions about how well I really knew this man. I dismissed their concern as unfamiliarity with modern relationships, as an older generation's discomfort with the idea that love could begin online and still be real. I did not yet understand that their silence was not judgment. It was fear for me, fear they did not know how to express without risking our friendship. My son called me once during this period, his voice tight with something I now recognize as barely restrained alarm. He had heard through a cousin that I was sending money to a man I had never met in person. He asked me carefully, delicately, whether I was certain about what I was doing. I remember feeling defensive, almost hurt, as though he were questioning my judgment simply because I was a widow finding companionship in her later years. I told him I understood these things could look strange from the outside, but that he needed to trust me, that I was not a foolish old woman being taken advantage of, that Michael was different, that our connection was different. I believed every word I said to my son that day. That is perhaps the most difficult part of this story to admit. I was not lying to protect a secret. I was lying because I had already been made to believe the lie myself, so thoroughly, so completely, that any challenge to it felt like an attack on something sacred rather than a warning I desperately needed to hear. By the time Michael's supposed departure date for India kept shifting, delayed by one manufactured crisis after another, I had given away nearly everything I had built across an entire lifetime. And still, some quiet, frightened part of me kept insisting that love this consuming, love this detailed and patient and tender, could not possibly be built on nothing at all. I did not yet know how wrong I was. I did not yet know that the very bank employee who would eventually save me from complete ruin was only a few weeks away from noticing the pattern in my transfers, a pattern that would finally begin to unravel everything I had convinced myself was true. The morning everything began to unravel started like any other. I walked to my local bank branch, a place I had visited so many times over the years that the staff greeted me by name, to arrange yet another international transfer. This one was meant to cover what Michael described as a final legal fee, the last obstacle he promised, before he could finally board a flight to India and put an end to months of separation. The young man handling my transaction that day was someone I had known for years, the son of a former colleague of mine. He had always been polite, always efficient, but that morning I noticed something different in the way he looked at my documents. He paused. He looked at his screen for longer than usual. Then he asked, in a voice that was gentle but firm, whether he could speak with me privately for a few minutes. I remember feeling a flicker of embarrassment, as though I had done something wrong, though I could not have told you what. We sat in a small office at the back of the branch, and he pulled up a record of my transactions over the previous months. He did not need to say much. The numbers themselves told a story I had refused to read until that moment. Transfer after transfer, each one larger than the last, each one sent to accounts in different countries, different names, different banks. He asked me carefully, without a trace of judgment in his voice, whether I personally knew the people receiving this money. I told him about Michael. I told him everything, the customs fees, the frozen accounts, the inheritance dispute, the promised wedding, the house with the wraparound porch. As I spoke, something strange happened. Hearing my own story out loud in the sterile light of that small office, I began to hear it the way an outsider might hear it. The words that had sounded like devotion in my own mind began to sound, spoken aloud to another person, like something else entirely. He did not tell me I was foolish. He did not raise his voice or dismiss what I had experienced. Instead, he told me, gently, that he had seen patterns like this before, that there was a name for what was happening to me, and that I needed to file a report immediately, both with the bank and with the local authorities who handled matters of financial fraud. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. It was not immediate relief. It was denial, sharp and instinctive, the same denial that had carried me through months of increasingly implausible excuses. I told him he must be wrong, that Michael was not like the men in the stories he was describing, that our connection was different, that I had spoken to him nearly every day for almost a year. But even as I said these words, some quiet part of me had already begun, reluctantly, to listen. I went home that day, and for the first time in months, I looked at Michael's profile with something other than affection. I studied the photographs more carefully. I searched for the image of him standing by the lake, the one that had first drawn me to reply to his message so long ago. Using a method my grandson had once shown me on his own phone, out of curiosity rather than suspicion, I searched for that photograph online. What I found broke something inside me that I am not sure has ever fully healed. The photograph belonged to a completely different man, a retired professor from a country I had never even considered, a man who had no idea his image was being used to construct a fictional identity across the world. His actual social media account, when I found it, showed years of ordinary family photographs, birthdays, holidays, grandchildren, a life entirely disconnected from anything Michael had told me. The golden retriever in the photographs belonged to this stranger's daughter. The lake was somewhere I had never even heard of before, thousands of miles from North Carolina. I sat with my phone in my hands for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to fully process what I was seeing. Every memory I had built over the past year, every message I had cherished, every small detail I believed made our connection unique, had been constructed using pieces stolen from a stranger's real life. The investigation that followed, conducted with the help of local police and eventually cybercrime specialists, revealed the full scope of what had happened to me. The passport Michael had once shown me during a brief blurry video call was confirmed to be fabricated. The documents he had emailed me over the months, supposed proof of his identity, his property, his finances, were digitally altered images, assembled convincingly enough to withstand a grieving, hopeful woman's scrutiny, but not the trained eye of investigators. What frightened me most was learning that I was not the only one. The investigators explained, carefully and without cruelty, that this operation appeared to be part of a larger network, one that specifically targeted older women, often widows, often isolated from family, often active on social media platforms where such connections could be initiated easily and cultivated slowly. The same photographs, the same fabricated backstory of a grieving engineer, had likely been used on other women in other countries, each of us believing, in our own separate corners of loneliness, that we alone had been chosen for something real. I remember asking one of the investigators, almost pleading with him, whether any part of what I had experienced could have been genuine, whether perhaps somewhere behind the fabricated identity there had been a real person who had, even briefly, felt something for me. He did not answer with false comfort. He told me, honestly, that in cases like this, the entire relationship was typically constructed from the very first message, built specifically to extract exactly what had been extracted from me. When I finally calculated the full extent of what I had lost, the number was staggering enough that even now, speaking about it, my voice tightens in my throat. Decades of retirement savings, investments built slowly and carefully across a lifetime of teaching, my mother's jewelry, and a piece of land that had belonged to my husband's family for generations, all of it gone, transferred piece by piece to accounts controlled by people whose real names I will likely never know. But even as this devastating financial reality set in, it was not surprisingly the deepest wound I carried. The deepest wound was quieter, harder to explain to people who had not lived through it. It was the realization that the version of myself who had felt loved for the first time in 9 years, who had laughed in her kitchen at a man's clumsy attempts to speak her language, who had felt seen and chosen and less alone in the world, had been responding to nothing at all. Not a person, not even a genuine effort at deception born from another lonely heart. Simply a script, refined through repetition, designed to locate exactly the kind of ache I carried and press on it until everything I had was gone. I had to face my children with this truth, a conversation more difficult than any I had prepared myself for. And I had to face, most difficult of all, the quiet mirror of my own reflection. Asking myself how a woman who had spent decades teaching young minds to think critically had allowed herself to be led, step by step, into losing everything she had spent a lifetime building. In the weeks that followed the investigation, I existed in a strange, suspended state that I can only describe as grief without a body to bury. I was mourning a man who had never existed, a future that had never been possible, and a version of myself I no longer recognized, one who had been capable, apparently, of being led so completely away from her own judgment. My son flew in from the United States within days of learning the full truth. I remember the look on his face when he arrived, not anger, though I had braced myself for it, but something closer to devastation, the particular pain of watching a parent suffer and realizing you were thousands of miles away while it happened. He did not say the words I had feared, the accusation I had silently prepared myself to hear. He simply held me in the doorway of the house I had lived in for so many silent years, and for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I allowed myself to cry without also trying to explain or defend anything. My daughter arrived a few days later, and together my children sat with me at the same table where I had once shared meals with Michael in my imagination, discussing not just the emotional damage, but the practical reality of what remained. The land was gone, sold to satisfy the loan I had taken against it. My retirement savings would need to be rebuilt, though at nearly 70 years old, rebuilding carries a different weight than it does for someone younger. a weight made of limited time rather than limited effort. My children, without a trace of resentment in their voices, began quietly organizing a plan to help support me, a plan I resisted at first out of pride and eventually accepted out of necessity. What surprised me most during this period was not the kindness of my children, which I had always trusted would be there in some form, but the reaction of my wider community once the story became known. I had expected judgment. I had expected whispers behind cupped hands at the market. The particular cruelty that small towns can sometimes offer to those seen as having brought misfortune upon themselves. Instead, I found something I did not expect at all. A neighbor, a woman I had known for over 20 years but never considered particularly close, came to my door one afternoon and told me quietly that something remarkably similar had happened to her own aunt several years earlier, though the family had never spoken of it openly out of shame. Another acquaintance from my late husband's side of the family confided that her own mother had lost a smaller but still significant sum to what sounded like an identical scheme, down to the fabricated customs delay and the frozen bank account excuse. I began to understand, through these quiet, hesitant confessions, that my story was not an isolated humiliation, but part of something much larger, something that had been happening in silence for years, precisely because shame kept the victims from speaking to one another. This realization did something unexpected to my grief. It did not erase the pain of what I had lost, but it transformed the nature of my shame. I stopped seeing myself solely as a foolish old woman who had been deceived, and began to see myself as one of many people, intelligent people, careful people, people who had simply been searching for connection in a world that had made them invisible, who had been systematically targeted by people who understood loneliness as a resource to be harvested rather than a wound to be respected. The investigators eventually explained to me, in more detail, how these operations typically functioned. The photographs, the fabricated biography, the carefully paced timeline of intimacy, followed by financial requests. All of it followed patterns that had been refined across countless previous attempts, sometimes run not by a single person, but by organized groups who divided responsibilities, one person managing the emotional conversations, another handling the financial requests, another maintaining the technical infrastructure of fake documents and manipulated video calls. Learning this did not make me feel less violated. If anything, it clarified the scale of what I had been up against, a scale that made my earlier self-blame feel, for the first time, somewhat unfair to the person I had been. Slowly, cautiously, I began speaking about my experience more openly, first with close family, then eventually with a small women's group at the local temple, several of whom, I discovered, had either experienced something similar themselves or knew someone who had. What began as a painful confession slowly became something closer to a warning I felt compelled to share, particularly with other widows and older women in my community who might be navigating the same aching loneliness that had made me so vulnerable in the first place. I will not pretend that recovery came easily or completely. There are still evenings when the silence of my house feels exactly as heavy as it did before any of this began. Evenings when I catch myself instinctively reaching for my phone, half expecting a message that I know now will never come from the person I believed had sent it. The habit of hope, once formed, does not disappear simply because you have learned the object of that hope was never real. But something did shift in me over time, something I can only describe as a kind of hard-won clarity. I began to understand that my mistake had not been in wanting connection, in wanting to be seen and cared for in the later years of my life. That desire was not foolish. It was human, and it remains human even now, even after everything I lost in pursuit of it. My mistake, if I can even call it that without excessive cruelty toward myself, was believing that connection built entirely through a screen, without the friction and inconsistency and physical presence of real relationships, could be trusted at the same pace and depth as something built slowly, in person, over years. My son eventually helped me set up stronger safeguards on my accounts, systems that would flag unusual transfers and require a waiting period before large sums could be sent internationally, a small but meaningful barrier against the particular kind of urgency that scammers rely upon to prevent their victims from having time to think clearly. My daughter, for her part, began calling more frequently, not out of obligation, but I think out of a newly sharpened awareness of how quickly silence can be filled by something dangerous if it is left unaddressed for too long. I think often about the version of myself who first received that friend request, who saw a kind face by a lake and felt, for just a moment, a flicker of possibility after years of feeling invisible. I do not hate her. I understand her completely, perhaps more completely than I have ever understood any other version of myself across my entire life. She was not naive in the way people often use that word cruelly. She was simply a woman who had been quietly starving for attention in a way that made her particularly susceptible to anyone patient enough to offer it convincingly. What I hope, when I share this story now, is not pity, and certainly not the kind of judgment that keeps other people in similar situations silent out of shame. What I hope is that someone listening, perhaps a woman much like I was, sitting alone in a quiet house with a phone in her hand and a heart still capable of hoping for companionship, might recognize the early signs of what happened to me before those signs have the chance to cost her everything she has built across a lifetime. I lost my retirement savings. I lost land that belonged to my husband's family for generations. I lost jewelry that carried the memory of my mother's hands. But what took the longest to rebuild, longer even than my finances, was my willingness to trust my own judgment again, to believe that I could still recognize real warmth when it appeared, without becoming so guarded that I closed myself off entirely from the very connection I had been searching for in the first place. I am still learning, even now, how to hold both of these truths at once, that the world contains people patient and cruel enough to construct an entire fictional love story purely to empty a lonely woman's savings, and that despite this, connection, real connection, remains worth seeking, carefully, slowly, with eyes open in a way mine were not open before. I share my story not as a warning against hope itself, but as a warning against the particular kind of hope that asks you to ignore everything you would normally question, simply because the person offering it seems to understand your loneliness a little too perfectly, a little too quickly, for it to have arrived by accident.